Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Vikki Thompson. She was a loving wife and mother of two who was brutally attacked and murdered in the mid-90s, and it wasn't too long before the police identified who they believed was responsible for this horrific crime. But despite this, it would be years and years before anyone was convicted. It would actually take a change in the law to bring this evil killer to justice, and it turns out that this case marked a huge turning point for the future of criminal and murder investigations. So for this week's case, we are going back about 27 years now to 1995 in a village called Ascot-under-Wychwood, which is located in the county of Oxfordshire in England. And this is Vikki Thompson. Vikki was 30 years old at the time that this case took place. She was born in 1965 and she lived in Oxfordshire with her family. Vikki was married to a man named Jonathan Thompson. They had been together for a long time. They were actually childhood sweethearts, and by the mid-90s they had two children together. They had a son named Matthew who was 7 years old, and their youngest was a daughter named Jenny, and Jenny was just 5. And they also had a dog too, a collie dog named Daisy. And Vikki was an incredible wife and mother. Her husband Jonathan described Vikki as being just so kind and caring and loving. She looked after her family. She always made time for both her husband and her kids. And Jonathan also said that Vikki always put 100% into every single thing that she did. According to news articles, Vikki worked as a waitress, and to be honest, there isn't much more information online about Vikki that I could find. On the whole, she just seemed like a lovely, happy person who just had a very normal, happy, quiet life with her family. As I said, they lived in Oxfordshire. They lived on a road called Chestnut Drive in Ascot-under-Wychwood, and by all accounts, they were happy there. Ascot-under-Wychwood is a beautiful village, a very, very little village. According to the 2011 census, it has a population of only about 560 people. So it was one of those areas where everyone knew everyone and there was a real sense of community. It was a nice, quiet place to live, a safe place to live, or at least it felt safe up until the summer of 1995 when a brutal murder was committed in the area, which just completely shook the residents and left them feeling absolutely terrified. The 12th of August 1995 started out as a day just like any other for Vikki Thompson. It was a Saturday, so Vikki was at home with her family, her two children and her husband Jonathan. And then at around 3:50, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Vikki decided that she was going to take the family dog Daisy out for a walk on her own, something that she obviously did every single day. So she put Daisy's lead on and she left the house whilst Jonathan stayed at home with the kids, Matthew and Jenny. Vikki obviously knew the area very well, and there were many very lovely walks around the area. There was a lot of countryside around, a lot of fields, and on this particular day, Vikki chose to walk down one of her usual routes along a footpath, a bridleway near her house. She would usually walk Daisy for about 30 minutes. She would walk so far along this footpath and then she would turn around and walk back home. This was just a part of her normal daily routine, and this was a walk that she had done several times before. And yet, for some reason, on this particular day, Vikki never returned home. Her dog, Daisy, did, but Vikki didn't. Around 4:30 p.m, about 30 to 40 minutes after Vikki left, Daisy, the dog, arrived back home without Vikki. And initially, her husband, Jonathan, didn't really worry too much. He didn't think that this was too odd. Daisy was clearly a dog that could be trusted off the lead, and I think he just assumed that Daisy Daisy had walked ahead on their journey back. Maybe Vicky had stopped and started chatting to someone, a friend, as she was walking home, and Daisy just continued walking towards the house. However, after a short while, Jonathan did start to get a little bit concerned because his wife still hadn't returned, and so he decided to go and try and find her. He put the kids in the car and he started driving around the area trying to see if he could spot Vicky anywhere, but he didn't. After having no luck, Jonathan returned home thinking that by this point Vicky would have been there and that he had just missed her as he was driving around, but she wasn't. There was no sign of her in the house, and so he quickly wrote Vicky a note and he left it on the table just in case she did come back, and then he went back out again to look for her. And I can only imagine that Jonathan was just getting more and more worried. That fear inside of him was just rising and rising, and I think he knew at this point that something had to be wrong. It was so out of Vicky's character to do something like this, so something must have happened to her. Luckily, Jonathan wasn't the only one out searching for Vicky. When a few of the locals heard that Vicky was missing, they also joined the search, and I think they all split up and searched different areas for any trace of her. And just a few hours later, at around 7 o'clock that evening, they found her. A couple who lived locally spotted a woman on the ground near the Cotswold railway track. This woman was lying in a pool of her own blood. She herself was covered in blood. It was clear just from looking at her that she had been the target of an incredibly brutal and vicious attack. This woman was, of course, 30-year-old Vikki Thompson, and she had been very, very badly beaten. However, incredibly, Vicky was still alive when this couple found her. She was still breathing, but she was in a very, very bad way. She was literally clinging onto life, and I think she was constantly coming in and out of consciousness. So as soon as she was found, emergency services were called straight to the scene. Vicky was immediately airlifted to hospital. She was taken to the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford, and she was put in intensive care with her husband Jonathan at her bedside, praying that she would pull through. I actually read in one news article that whilst Vicky was in intensive care, Jonathan would play music from the film Pretty Woman, which was Vicky's favourite film, and he was hoping that it would kind of bring her round, and if she could hear it, it would encourage her to fight, to not give up. But sadly, Vicky's injuries were just way too extensive. She had been beaten around the head repeatedly with some kind of heavy, blunt object, probably either a rock or a brick, and this resulted in numerous skull fractures and very severe brain injuries. Eventually, her brain just stopped functioning, and 6 days after the attack, Vicky's life support machine was turned off and she passed away. So this was now a murder inquiry. Vikki Thompson had been murdered, and the police had the task of trying to find the monster that did this to her and work out why. Why had this happened to her? Why did someone attack her while she was just simply walking her dog? What was the motive here? As I mentioned earlier on in the video, this murder just completely shocked everyone that lived in Ascot-under-Wychwood. This was such a small and quiet and friendly and for the most part crime-free village. Things like this just did not happen in this area, so I think it left everyone feeling very, very shaken up and just so scared. And the main reason they were so scared was because I think right from the start of this investigation, the police strongly suspected that the person who did this was probably a local. After attacking Vicky, the killer had obviously fled from the scene, and they would have had to have known the area well to know where they could go to escape quickly and not be seen. They would have had to have known the routes. I've also read on a few sources that the police believed the killer left Vicky's body on the embankment by the railway line because they hoped that it would look like Vicky had just been hit by a train, and that's how she got her injuries. So the killer knew where the train tracks were, and they knew where they could go to get away fast. This all indicated to the police that the perpetrator lived nearby. So everyone in the village was so frightened. They knew that there was a killer living amongst them, a killer that could potentially strike again if the police don't apprehend them quickly. Of course, as soon as Vicky was found after she was taken to the hospital, the area where she was discovered was cordoned off by the police as it was now a crime scene. They searched the area and they collected any potential evidence, and one thing that they found at the scene was actually a shoe print in blood in the grass. It looked like it had been made by a boot of some kind, not the kind of shoes that Vicky was wearing, so it appeared as though this boot print had come from the murderer. And they also found a load of rocks and stones that had Vicky's blood on. It's believed that these may have been used by the killer to try and cover up Vicky's body. And as all of this was going on, as authorities were preserving the crime scene, other officers were conducting door-to-door inquiries, asking everyone that lived nearby if they'd seen or heard anything that might have been relevant to the case. According to a few sources, they did receive some information from a couple of people that lived nearby who said that they heard the sound of someone screaming around the time that it's believed Vicky was attacked, not too far from where she was later found. And these screams lasted for less than a minute. The police strongly believed that they had come from Vicky. Some reports say that a dog was also heard barking, so perhaps that was Daisy the collie dog. Maybe Daisy was there when the attack started and she started barking and then she decided to run back home. In addition to the door-to-door inquiries, the police also appealed to the public and the media, in which they urged potential witnesses to come forward, and a £10,000 reward for information was offered. And less than a month after the murder, in September of 1995, Vicky's case was also featured on an episode of Crime Watch. They filmed a reconstruction of Vicky's movements on the day that she was attacked, and it was also during this Crime Watch appeal that the police revealed some pretty big information that hadn't been released to the public yet. They revealed some information that had been provided to them by a man who lived locally. He got in touch with the police after Vicky's attack and said that he had seen something really odd that day around the same time that Vicky would have been assaulted. This man said that he was out walking his dog that afternoon. He was walking along a path near the same area where Vicky would have been walking and was attacked, when at approximately 4 p.m. he saw a man on the other side of this hedge wearing absolutely nothing. He was just completely naked. And then shortly after this, he saw the same naked guy a second time running through a field. And of course, the man who witnessed this just thought it was so strange, and he knew that he should report it to the police after he heard about what happened to Vicky. And I think instantly the police strongly suspected that this naked man was probably the murderer, and maybe the reason he was naked was because this crime was sexually motivated. As far as I'm aware, Vicky hadn't been raped or sexually assaulted by the attacker, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't a sexual element to the crime. Perhaps the twisted individual that did this didn't feel the need to assault Vicky in that way. They got enough sexual gratification just from beating her and feeling in control. Or maybe they intended to sexually assault her, but they didn't get round to it. Maybe after they beat her, they felt that they didn't have enough time to do that. They needed to get away quickly. The witness described this naked man as being white. He had pale skin, he was thin, and he was rather tall, over 6 foot in height, and he estimated that he was probably aged somewhere between 20 to 30 years old. The police were actually quite heavily criticised when they revealed this information on Crime Watch. People couldn't understand why it had taken them weeks to tell the public about this naked man that had been seen, because obviously that seems like very important information in the murder inquiry. But apparently the police just said that they didn't release this witness account sooner because they didn't want to, quote, sensationalize it. I guess maybe just in case there was a chance that this incident didn't have any relevance to the case. But anyway, this information about the naked man was revealed, and following the Crime Watch episode, the police police continued going through all of the tips and potential leads that they had received. Meanwhile, they were also looking into, I think, pretty much every single man that lived in the village, because obviously, as I said a minute ago, the theory was that the killer was a local. So they started looking into all of the men that lived nearby, trying to identify whether any of them could have been the perpetrator. And there was one man in particular that seemed to stand out from the rest, a man named Mark Weston. He was around 19 years old at the time that this case took place, and he lived in the village with his mum. His house was actually located very close to Vicky's home on Chestnut Drive. He lived about 150 yards away, so he also lived close to the crime scene. He worked as an odd jobs man mostly, although he never really had a steady income, I don't believe. He was constantly going from job to job. He was actually fired from a job once, just days after he started, when it was discovered that he had been stealing from a co-worker, so clearly he was someone that couldn't be trusted. Mark enjoyed fishing, he would often go out cycling, he frequented the same footpaths and lanes that Vicky would walk along, and he was known in the village as just being a bit of a loner, someone that kept to themselves for the most part. Although, as I understand it, he didn't really have any history of violence or anything that anyone knew about anyway. And Mark Weston seemed to match the description of the naked man that was seen very well. He was tall, white, pale, thin, he was nearly 20 years old. I'm not entirely sure why Mark Weston initially really stood out to the police as a potential person of interest. Perhaps it was just because he really did match the description of the naked man. However, he quickly became pretty much the top suspect in the case, following the discovery of some underwear that was found further down the lane where Vicky's body was discovered not long after she was attacked. It was women's underwear that didn't belong to Vicky. However, when tested, scientists identified traces of semen on the material, and it turns out that this semen was a match to 19-year-old Mark Weston. His semen was found on women's underwear that had been discovered on the ground in an area not far from where Vicky was beaten. So that put Mark Weston near the scene of the crime on the day that it happened. So it was after this when I think the police became pretty convinced that Mark Weston was their guy. He was the one that did this to Vicky. One of the theories that they came up with was that maybe if Mark Weston was that naked man that was seen, he was out on the lane that day, maybe masturbating with that women's underwear, and perhaps as Vicky was walking with her dog Daisy, she came across Mark and disturbed him. Perhaps she even threatened to call the police, and so he decided to attack her to silence her. So after they had matched the semen on this underwear to Mark Weston, the police went to Mark's home in September of 1995 and they arrested him. He was then taken to the police station where he was questioned about Vicky's murder, and he denied it. He said that it wasn't him. Apparently he did admit to knowing Vicky, not personally. He said that he just knew of her because they obviously lived in the same very small village where everyone knew everyone, and he also admitted to actually having been down the footpath, down the same lane that Vicky had been walking along on the afternoon that she was attacked. He said that he went along that route because he was headed to someone's house, I think maybe at the end of the lane or something. He said that he owed someone that lived there some money, so he went to go and pay it back. But he claimed that after this, he went straight home and he didn't mention having seen Vicky that afternoon or having seen anything suspicious. Although according to sources, during his questioning, his story just kept changing constantly. He was never able to stay consistent. So like, for example, he kept changing what time it was when he walked down the lane that day. So the police didn't believe him, not just because of the underwear and semen evidence, but also because they did receive reports from, I think, quite a few people who said that they saw him. They saw Mark on the lane around the same time that Vicky would have been there. So not only did the underwear place him near the scene of the crime, but so did these witness accounts. Although I should mention that no one actually saw him with Vicky, they just saw him in the area around the time that Vicky was attacked. But in addition to that, the police also received even more information about Mark Weston. They received witness statements from people who said that, again, on the afternoon of the crime, the afternoon of the 12th of August, they saw Mark in his garden having a fire basically. Although, just as a side note, one article I read said that it was actually the day after that this happened, but regardless, at some point soon after the attack, he was seen having a fire in his garden, and it looked as though the thing he was burning on this fire was clothing. And why would he be doing that? Why would he burn his clothes unless he was trying to destroy evidence? Even though it's believed he was the naked man, he probably wouldn't have left his house naked. He probably would have removed his clothes once he got to the lane. And maybe if he was the killer, he put them back on before he beat Vicky and they had her blood on them. Or perhaps his bundle of clothes were just on the ground or something as he attacked her and blood splattered onto them. Whatever the circumstances, he likely knew that he had to dispose of them, and it appeared as though from the witness accounts that he did that by burning them in his garden. And so following all of this, the police felt as though they had enough to charge Mark Weston with the crime. So I believe he was rearrested because he was released about 12 hours after his first arrest, after he had been interviewed, but he was eventually rearrested, and it was then when he was ultimately charged with the murder of Vikki Thompson. But he was still adamant that he was innocent. He said that he was not the killer, and so when it came to his court proceedings, he pleaded not guilty, which meant that the case would have to go to trial. And the trial took place just the year after the murder in 1996. And unfortunately, this trial did not go the way that the police and the prosecution had hoped, because at the end of it, the jury actually decided that he was not guilty. Mark Weston was acquitted. And the main reason for this was because there just wasn't enough evidence to prove in court that Mark was the one who did it. The police had not obtained any solid concrete evidence linking him directly to the crime. All of the evidence against him was circumstantial, so like the fact that he was seen burning his clothes after the attack, even though that does look incredibly suspicious, it's not necessarily proof that he was the killer. The fact that his story kept changing, again suspicious, but not hard evidence. He could just argue that he was inconsistent in his interviews because he was nervous and on edge or something. His semen on that women's underwear, yes, it was found near the scene of the crime, but it's not direct evidence connecting him to Vicky's murder. Every single thing that the police had collected was circumstantial evidence, and it turns out actually that the semen and underwear evidence wasn't even presented in court during the trial. The judge decided that it would not be shown to the jury. I'm not sure why, but that was his ruling. And this really was the police's biggest piece of evidence. Even though it was still circumstantial, it was their strongest piece of circumstantial evidence, and the jury never got to hear about it. So anyway, as I said, at the end of the trial, Mark was acquitted. He was released and he went back to live in Ascot under Wychwood with his mother. And as I'm sure you can imagine, this was so devastating for Vicky's family. The fact that she hadn't received the justice that she deserved. They wholeheartedly believed that Mark Weston was her killer, but he had gotten away with it. He was a free man. And other people in the area, the other residents of the village, didn't really know what to think. Some people agreed with the family. They still believed that he was the person responsible for this horrific crime, whereas others believed that he really was innocent. The jury were right to find him not guilty, and that the murderer, the real murderer, was still on the loose. After his acquittal, Mark Weston did interviews with, I think, like local TV news stations, where he again protested his innocence, said that the police had the wrong guy. The interview hinted that Mark actually intended to try and get some compensation money for the 10 months that he had spent in custody during the lead up to his trial, although I'm unsure if anything ever came of that. You would have thought that after something like this happening to you, after being accused of murder and then acquitted, you would kind of want to maybe keep your head down for a while, lead a rather quiet life, especially whilst many people in your area still have their doubts about your innocence. But that didn't appear to be the case with Mark Weston. After his release, he actually started to kind of terrorize some of the local people. He targeted this policeman that lived in the village with his family, and he started just harassing him. Mark was leaving him horrible phone calls and voicemails. Mark had chickens. I think his family kept some animals in their garden, and one day Mark killed one of these chickens. He decapitated it, and then he left it outside this police officer's front door. I don't know why he targeted this officer in particular. I wonder whether this was one of the officers perhaps involved in building the case against Mark Weston before his trial or something. But as well as that, he also started harassing one of his neighbours. One of his neighbours was a woman, and he pretty much started stalking her. He would watch her through the windows. He would stand at the bottom of his garden and watch her while she was in the bathroom. He would watch her getting undressed and getting into the shower, just really, really creepy stuff like that. And she knew about it as well. She had caught him doing it, and she was so uncomfortable with this, as I'm sure any woman would be. It turns out as well that this neighbour had even given evidence for the defence for Mark's side during his trial. She claimed that on the day that Vikki Thompson was attacked, she saw Mark Weston most of that afternoon just in his garden. She didn't see him all afternoon in his garden, but for most of it she claimed that that's where he was. And I imagine that this must have been crucial evidence for the defence during the trial. She really helped Mark Weston's case, and yet despite that, after he was released, he started watching her and just being really, really gross and inappropriate. It was almost like he didn't care though. It was like after he was acquitted, he felt invincible. He could do whatever he wanted and he would get away with it. He wouldn't have to face any consequences. And unfortunately, after his not guilty verdict, Vicky's case, I guess, just kind of went cold. It was never officially closed or anything. It was still open, but I feel like the detectives didn't really know what to do, because despite him being found not guilty, they, just like Vicky's family, still strongly believed that Mark was the one who did this, but they couldn't do anything now. In the eyes of the law, he was not responsible for this crime, so that was that. They couldn't take him to trial again because of double jeopardy. The double jeopardy laws in place at the time prevented a person from being tried again for the same crime if they had already been found not guilty by a jury. So it seemed as though if Mark Weston really was the killer, he was never going to have to face punishment. He really had gotten away with murder. But then in 2003, there was a little glimmer of hope for the police and Vicky's loved ones when the double jeopardy laws in England and Wales were changed. In the lead up to this, so before 2003, many people campaigned for a change in double jeopardy laws in the UK. They felt as though it should be possible for someone who has already been acquitted of a crime to go to trial again if new evidence is found linking them to the offence. Because if you think about it, forensic technology is changing all the time. It's constantly getting better and better. And let's say, for example, a person is tried for murder in the mid-80s when DNA and forensic technology was a very new thing. It was in its infancy and therefore not very good. And so they were found not guilty by a jury due to a lack of evidence. Well, what if years and years later, when forensic science was a lot more advanced, new solid DNA evidence was uncovered, which concretely linked that same person, same suspect, to the crime, proving that they were in fact responsible. Despite that, they would never be able to go to trial again. Despite this new groundbreaking evidence, they would remain a free individual because of double jeopardy legislations. There were a lot of flaws in these laws, so this led to a lot of campaigning. People wanted to see a change happen, and as I said, in 2003 that change came. Within the Criminal Justice Act of 2003, it was decided that people who have already been tried and acquitted for the most serious of crimes, i.e. assault, murder, etc., they could be tried again only if fresh and viable evidence came to light. And I believe this officially came into force in 2005. So as soon as this change was made in 2005, the case into Mark Weston was pretty much reopened by the Thames Valley Police a decade after Vikki Thompson's murder. Their plan was to take Mark to trial again for this crime, but of course they couldn't do that until they found new solid evidence that a second jury could not refute. And to do this, detectives decided that they were basically going to go over everything again. Every single detail of the case, every statement, every lead, just in case there was something that they missed in the original investigation. They were also going to go over all of the items and evidence that they had collected so far and had just been kept in storage all these years, because obviously by this point, as I said, there would have been many developments and advancements in forensic technology. So maybe scientists might be able to find evidence on these items now that they couldn't find in the mid-90s when this case occurred. And one item in particular that was re-examined, or two items I should say, were a pair of boots that Mark Weston owned. Now, if you recall from earlier on in the video, when Vikki Thompson was found and she was taken to the hospital and the crime scene was searched, on one patch of grass the detectives discovered a boot print in blood. This print hadn't come from Vicky's shoes, so it had to have come from the killers. Now, when Mark was arrested shortly after Vicky's death, the police did find a pair of boots, I believe, in his house. So they were collected as potential evidence alongside other items of clothing. And these boots that Mark owned seemed to match the kind of boot that the police believed would have made that bloody boot print. So that was more evidence linking him to the crime, but again, it was just circumstantial. Just because he had similar boots, that doesn't necessarily prove that it was his boot in particular that made the print. Now, at the time in the mid-90s, these boots that Mark owned were sent off for testing. Police wanted to see if scientists could find any DNA on them, any blood, because of course if they can find blood on his boots and that blood is a match to Vikki, that's not just circumstantial evidence, that's concrete proof that he was the one responsible for the attack. But at the time in the 90s when they were examined, there was nothing. No blood was found on either of the boots. However, a decade later, when the case was reopened, the police wanted to carry out tests on these boots again, just in case there was any chance that something could have been missed. And in 2008, so 3 years after the reopening of the case, there was a huge breakthrough. Mark Weston's boots were sent off to be retested, and this time they were actually pretty much completely torn apart and dismantled so that forensic experts could really get into the little nooks and crannies of these boots. And when they did this and they took swabs and samples, they in fact did find traces of blood, little tiny specks of blood. And when this blood was tested, it was found to have been a match to the murder victim, 30-year-old Vikki Thompson. It's believed that the reason this blood was not detected in the original investigation was because the place where these blood spots were was kind of underneath a section of the boot where the leather overlapped. So I think it was unfortunately just human error that this was missed back when the boots were first seized. So finally, the police had the evidence that they so desperately needed. Vicky's blood on Mark's boot proved that he had to be the murderer, because how else do you explain that? How could Vicky's blood have gotten on his shoes unless he was the one who beat her to death that day? Clearly, for whatever reason, he decided to keep these boots. He didn't dispose of them like it's believed he did the rest of his clothing, the clothing that he burned in his garden. And the police think that he meticulously cleaned them after the murder, which is why the only blood on them was found underneath an overlap of the material. No blood was found on the surface areas. Why he decided to keep them, we don't know. Maybe he just really liked them and he didn't want to have to chuck them out. Or maybe he even kept them as some kind of trophy. He wanted something to keep as a reminder of what he had done to Vikki, who knows. After obtaining this new fresh evidence linking Mark Weston to the crime, the detectives approached the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service. They presented them with their new evidence, the blood on the boot, in the hopes that they would be given approval to go ahead and arrest Mark Weston for this crime again after all these years. And luckily they were given permission. They obtained an arrest warrant, and in October of 2008 2009, Mark Weston, who by this point was in his early 30s, he was apprehended and he was shocked. By this point, it had obviously been like 14 years since Vicky's murder, and I imagine he must have come to the conclusion that he was never going to have to face punishment for this. He had escaped capture, so it was a huge shock to him when he was rearrested all those years later. And just like he had done all those years ago, Mark continued to deny it. Once again, he was adamant that he did not do it, even when he was confronted with the blood evidence. And so it was decided by the CPS that there would be a retrial. Mark Weston was going to have to be tried a second time for murder. His second trial took place in December of 2010 at Reading Crown Court, and luckily this time the evidence presented by the prosecution was enough to convince the jury of Weston's guilt. As I said, the blood on the boot was incredibly damning evidence, and so at the end of his trial he was convicted of the murder of 30-year-old Vikki Thompson. Finally, more than 15 years after this case occurred, Vicky's killer had been brought to justice. Because Mark Weston never confessed and has never confessed to this day, we still don't know what the motive was for this horrific crime, why Mark decided that Vicky had to die that day. But I think the theory that most people believe is the one that I mentioned earlier, that Vicky stumbled upon Mark Weston naked that afternoon. He was acting inappropriately, possibly masturbating with that women's underwear, and she confronted him, and so he attacked her. Mark Weston was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 13 years, which I actually cannot believe. 13 years, I think personally, is just insulting. I cannot understand why it was so low. I mean, it is still life in prison, so there is no guarantee that even after 13 years he will be released, but it does mean that he can apply for parole after 13 years, which will actually be just next year. He was convicted in 2010, so his minimum term will come to an end in 2023. I just hope that he isn't considered for release for a long time yet. Vicky deserves better than that. I mean, no sentence would ever be long enough, let's be honest, but 13 years, that's just so unfair and disappointing in my opinion. I can't imagine how much upset that sentence must have caused Vicky's family. Now, after Mark Weston was convicted and sent to prison, an ex-partner of his actually came out and told her story about how she was horrifically abused by Mark Weston during their relationship. Her name was Helen Rusher, and she met Mark in 2001, so in the gap between his first and second trial. He would have been around 25 by then, and Helen was just 15 years old. But despite that, despite the fact that she was literally a child, Mark was instantly attracted to Helen. He wanted to be with her, and so he started grooming her pretty much. He would buy her gifts and boxes of chocolates, flowers. He would compliment her all the time. So of course, eventually Helen really started to like him back. She probably loved the attention that this older man was giving her. She was just a teenage girl, so I imagine she was probably easy to manipulate for Mark. So they started dating, and it wasn't long before Mark proposed to Helen, and she said yes, so they were engaged. But Mark soon became abusive towards Helen and incredibly controlling. He demanded to know where she was every second of every day. He became very paranoid, and he would accuse her of cheating on him even though she hadn't. And as well as being mentally and emotionally abusive, he was also sexually abusive. He would rape Helen. Apparently, he would demand that they had sex at least 4 times a day, and if she wasn't keen, he didn't care. He would just force her into doing it with him. Eventually, Helen fell pregnant with Mark's child, and in May of 2003, she gave birth to a baby girl. But despite this, Mark's abuse did not stop. He continued to abuse Helen and also their baby. One day, not long after Helen gave birth, the family of 3 had been out shopping, and they were really short on money at the time. They only had about £10 between them, and they needed nappies or diapers. So of course, course, Helen said, okay, we need to use this £10 to get nappies. But Mark refused to buy his daughter some nappies because he wanted to spend the £10 on a bottle of vodka for himself. And he got so angry at Helen for this, for saying that they should use it to get nappies, that later that same day, he attacked her. He literally grabbed her around the neck and started to strangle her, and then he pushed her head onto their baby so that Helen was squashing the baby. Thankfully, both Helen and the baby survived this horrific attack, but it was following this when Helen knew that she had to get away from this monster. She had to leave him to protect her daughter. So one night she crept out of the house with the baby and she got a taxi to her parents' home. And Mark was so furious with Helen for leaving him. He started ringing her constantly and sending her vile text messages, basically threatening to kill her. And in one of these messages, Mark even semi-confessed to the murder of Vikki Thompson. Obviously, Helen knew about everything that had happened all those years prior with the Vikki Thompson case. She knew that Mark had previously been acquitted of her murder. And when they met, she believed Mark. She believed that he really was innocent of that crime. But then after she left him, he sent her a text saying, quote, "I killed her and would do the same to you." And it was clear to Helen in this text that Mark was referring to Vikki Thompson. So she immediately got in touch with the police, but unfortunately at the time there was still nothing that they could do. Mark had been found not guilty, so even though he had semi-confessed in this text, they couldn't do anything. Helen ultimately went through the courts and she eventually got a non-molestation order against Mark, and I imagine she must have been so incredibly relieved when in 2010 he was finally found guilty of Vicky's murder and he was going to be in prison for a long time. But that is it for this case. That is the case of 30-year-old Vikki Thompson. It turns out that this was a case that actually made history because Mark Weston was the first person in England, I believe, to face a second murder trial and be found guilty following the discovery of new forensic evidence. So this really did mark such a huge turning point for other murder cases and criminal investigations. Please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on this case in the comments. As always, I would love to hear what you guys have to say. And whilst you're at it, also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can let me know in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box of all of my videos. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye.